Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Hayes of the Redeeming Life Ministries Church in Stanton, Virginia. This is part two of a series of Wednesday night lectures I'm doing on the Song of Solomon, also noted in the Bible as the Song of Songs, and it's listed as one of the poetic books. As we discussed in the previous session or episode, the Song of Songs is one of the most mysterious books of the Bible for interpretation. One of the reasons for that is that there is no narrator in the Song of Songs, telling us, and then he said this, and then she said that, and telling us who the characters are. It rather reads like a drama than a story or a narrative poem. A drama is the type of literature in which every line is dialogue and somebody talking to somebody. Our problem in modern Bibles is we don't have the name of the person who's speaking this line and the name of the person speaking the next line. And I look at this as a play written in 6 scenes and with 5 speaking characters or groups of characters. I'm iterating some of the things I said last week. I won't take too long at this. But the characters are the star of the poem. That is Shulamith. Now, I know a lot of us have been taught to say Shunammite or Shulamite, and that is because of the theory that this girl is none other than Abishag, the girl who had been put in by Solomon's brother Adonijah to keep old dying King David occupied while Adonijah tried to steal the throne. And of course Adonijah, and after David died, Adonijah, Solomon's older brother, and Abishag were still plotting to find some way to take the throne away from Solomon. And Solomon recognized the plot and had Adonijah slain, executed for treason, and then had Abishag, the girl, shuffled away back to the north where she came from. There's some biblical evidence that she came from a town called Shunem, and because some old doctrinaire theologians years back believed that the girl Solomon is writing about in the Song of Songs is none other than Abishag, and he didn't want to put her name in it, so he called her the Shunammite. But that's not actually what this is. This is not Abishag, and this girl is not from Shunem. She is actually called in the Hebrew Shulamith, not the Shulamite, or Shunammite, but Shulamith. It's probably a figurative name Solomon gives this girl, not wanting to put her real name in for reasons that will become clear as we go through it. But he calls her Shulamite or Shulamith because that is a feminine form of the name Solomon. In other words, by calling this girl this name, Shulamith, he's saying, you're the perfect match for me. You would be my mirror image. You would be my true equal yoke fellow. Now, at what time did Solomon write this perplexing love poem? I suspect, in my translation, Solomon, these events occurred when Solomon was a young man. His son Rehoboam would have been just a tyke. David was recently dead. Solomon's wife, Naamah the Ammonitess, is the mother of his son Rehoboam. And Solomon's mother, in the 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs, Solomon's mother, anybody know her name? Bathsheba, the famous Bathsheba. And she had told Solomon, find the perfect woman whose price is above rubies. Don't do what your daddy David did. Don't give your strength to women or your integrity to that which destroys kings, but rather find this one perfect bride and stick with her. Well, Solomon's having some difficulty politically as a very young king, partly because his wife, Naamah, is from Ammon, not Israel. She's Ammonite. And Rehoboam then is half Ammonite. And there's some political rumblings that maybe Solomon better get some other sons of Israelite women to have an acceptable son on the throne with pure Israelite blood and so forth. Well, okay, maybe Solomon as a young man is acting on this. If we read Solomon's brief autobiography in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapters 3, 4, and 5, where he's talking about his earlier years, when he was building and he was experimenting and he found that doing this or participating in that, he would tell a few lines about each one of his activities, and then he'd say, but behold, it was all vanity, and a vexation of spirit. So I tried this and I tried that. And at one point he says, and I wanted to discern between wisdom and folly, between sanity and madness. And so I experimented with different things. And I noticed everybody drinks wine, though my mother Bathsheba said to me, it is not for kings. Oh, Lemuel, that was her pet name for Solomon. It is not for kings to drink wine or strong drink, lest they forget their position and they forget their reason and they pervert the way of judgment. Now, Bathsheba is quoting Moses there, but Moses didn't say that about kings not drinking wine. Moses, the day that Aaron's sons, Aaron the high priest, the day that his two sons, Nadab and Abihu, went into the tabernacle and brought strange fire, the fire of the Lord came down and slew them right there in the holy place. They had to be dragged out, because who's going to go in there when God's fire is falling and killing people? Right after that, Moses says to their father Aaron, it is not for priests to drink wine or strong drink, lest they would pervert justice and use wrong judgment. And so there Moses puts an anathema, thus saith the Lord. Priests must never touch wine or strong drink. Well, now here's Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, saying, it's not just for priests not to do it, it's not for kings to do it either, boy. Well, okay, some years have passed. Solomon's looking around. He's trying to understand. He's going to write a bunch of proverbs. He's still a young king, but he wants to understand the fate of the fool versus the fate of the wise man, the fate of the wicked man versus the fate of the righteous man. And many of his proverbs will be about those things, the fate of the giver as opposed to the fate of the taker and user. And all of his proverbs will be, looking at one or the other. But Solomon's looking around at people and learning this. And at one point he says, we'll get into this if we ever do a class on Ecclesiastes. He said, one thing that seems vanity to me so far is that whether a man is good or bad, wise or foolish, they all go to the same place in the end. They all go to the grave. And then, therefore, what is the point of being wiser? Couldn't I just live my life out as a fool? What benefit do I get from being wise or seeking wisdom? And he's asking these reasonable questions, the one after another. And in one point he said, so in those years, looking back at his youth, he's writing Ecclesiastes as an old man, but he's looking back at his younger years. He said, at one point, I decided to give myself to wine, to see if I could drink wine and still retain wisdom. And behold, the experiment was vanity of vanities. Now that's his one admission, that he did drink wine. His mother told him not to do it, and she said, in some other things in Proverbs 31, she says, and also don't pervert judgment. As a king, judge righteously. Look at the man who has no attorney to plead for him, and take up his case, for he's pleading for himself, and deliver the innocent from the accuser, and on and on. And then she goes into this poem of the virtuous woman, listing 22 virtues about the perfect wife, and adjuring Solomon to find such a woman. I think that he's telling us how in his younger years he stepped aside from Queen Naamah, his Ammonite wife and mother of his son Rehoboam, and he said, it's time for me to start looking for the woman mother told me to find. And he thinks he has found her. We'll get into this part of the story when we get into the full text of the Song of Songs, which won't be tonight. But he thinks he has found her in this girl, but Solomon is drinking at the time when he's a young man meeting this girl. She's not in love with him. She doesn't want to be a king's bride. Solomon finds that she is in love with a shepherd and will not break her covenant promise to her shepherd with whom she is engaged. So this is what is so striking to Solomon. What woman wouldn't want to marry a king? Any of them would, except her. She doesn't want any of the riches, any of the fame, any of the power. She just wants to be married to the shepherd because she loves him and he loves her. She calls her espoused or engaged fiance my beloved, and he calls her my beloved. And that's their word for one another. Solomon, however, wants to come in between them because he thinks she'll be the perfect bride his mother wanted him to marry. So her brothers. Now, Shulamith is the star of the poem. She's the main speaking character. Next, she has 5 brothers. And they want her to marry the king. They're all older than she is. And she refuses them. And we'll also get into that. Then there's the shepherd himself. And we have him speaking on a number of occasions. In dream sequences or flashbacks, the girl will be telling her friends, now here's what the shepherd said to me on that time, and here's what he said to me on this other time, and here's how I still remember how we met under an apple tree out in the sheep pasture by the river, and she's remembering all that in flashbacks. Then there's a chorus group, the daughters of Jerusalem. None of them are really daughters of Jerusalem. They are the different brides that Solomon has married for diplomatic reasons, and some of them are foreign girls, but they live in the harem. And many of them, as we'll see especially in the Song of Solomon, are known as virgins, though they've been married to Solomon for some years. That's quite telling. And then we have Solomon himself, who speaks on 3 occasions, once trying to woo her with suggestive talk in his tent up in the north. A second time he has her brought, or his brothers bring her to Jerusalem, and Solomon has her in his private quarters trying to seduce her, if we can use that word, to agree to marry him. But no, she has heard the voice of her shepherd calling her name in the street. And she turns from King Solomon and looks out his window, and sure enough, down there in the marketplace is her shepherd. He's walked all those hundreds of miles, or scores of miles, from the north, the Lebanon border, all the way down through the hills and twisting turns to Jerusalem. to rescue his beloved sweetheart from the king. Now, she's the perfect woman, but we have to imagine if she did marry Solomon, she wouldn't stay perfect long, because she would be one of the other brides, and influences corrupt and so forth. And she doesn't want to be one of those, and her shepherd doesn't want. And Solomon looks out the window and she points him out. That's my beloved down there. I read this to you from my short story last week. And Solomon looks at her face and realizes that he can never have her, because he can never win from her as much love as that shepherd has won. And the shepherd stands there with a stick in his hand, glaring up at her. Solomon brings her out on the balcony so he can see her. And he cries, "My beloved," and she whispers, "My beloved." She doesn't yell it because she's standing next to the king. But he's down in the street yelling it, and people are grabbing his arms and pulling him back, saying, Don't yell so. That's the king standing up there. And he shakes them off, and they step away from him, and he stands forward, not ever looking at the king, just looking at her, into her eyes. Now, I wrote a short story about it, and I didn't get it all finished reading it last week. I'm going to continue with my version of the story tonight, if that's not going to be too boring to you. And it'll be next Wednesday night where we actually open the Bible to read the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But this is the last night of the story. Solomon takes the girl by the arm and brings her inside and says, "Go down to him. No, wait. I myself will take you down." And down the flight of stairs and out into the garden, and he commands 2 soldiers to open the gate and bring that shepherd in. And that's pretty much where we left off. The 2 soldiers came in holding the man between them. This is a short story I wrote, so bear with me. By the way, in this story, Solomon is telling all of this to the Queen of Sheba. He's now an old man. She has come to visit him. All of his palaces are built. By the time she comes, the temple is built. Solomon's in the last quarter, probably the last 10 years of his reign as king. All the story he's telling her are things that happened in his very early years as king. All right. 2 soldiers came in, holding the man between them, asking me, Solomon says, if this were the varlet I had called for, and releasing him at my word, they standing back from him, one of them still holding the man's stick in his burly hand to assure me that he had disarmed him, looking suspiciously at him. I dismissed the 2 soldiers. They turned reluctantly, looking again at him from behind, up and down his frame, loathing everything about him, nodding again to me to show me they'd be just outside the gate, listening for the trouble they were certain would come. But the 2 soldiers stopped at the open gate for a 3rd soldier, who stepped in to announce them, the wedding party, the kinsmen and brothers of the girl. They had just arrived, the hopeful country family who had come in their best scraped up and borrowed finery to attend the big city marriage of their kinswoman to the king. They who just now had been told that he, the shepherd, was here also. They who had run too late to prevent him. A wave of my hand brought them in as well. Another wave dismissed the 3 soldiers. The gate closed, shutting us all into the little garden. There we were, the politely smiling king, the happy yet apprehensive girl, the defiant, wondering shepherd, dirty from his lonely, penniless trek, and the surprised and angry and still hopeful, genuflecting pack of brothers who desperately wanted to be a king's in-laws and who wanted to have their say, to demand the arrest, the ostracism, or even the death of this repugnant shepherd who had violated their hopes by wooing their sister. He who had dared impudently to come here, but whom I, Solomon, now could see only as though I were seeing David, my father, in the old stories, standing against bears, lions, and giants. The Queen of Sheba says, Solomon, your wisdom in this, no, my queen, this is no wisdom. Not yet. It was only surrender. Surrender to what I could not defeat. The only true surrender I have ever made. Wisdom from this came to me later. I observed it all and later considered. Later, says the Queen of Sheba, when then? Oh, about an hour later, after I had left them there and had gone back up into my quarters. I watched from the other window there over the garden, hearing them talk, but none but she knew or guessed that I would be listening. I had simply stood forward and had taken her hand and brought her over to him, the country bumpkin who hadn't even the training to know that he should bend his knee before a king. And I had taken his hand and had placed hers in it, saying, Man, take thy good bride to thee. And I turned from them all, from the couple who saw nothing but each other, from the miserable, surprised bridal party who now rose from their knees protesting. I knew, silently gesturing behind my back for me to turn and reconsider and hear them beg for me to take her. But I didn't turn for them. I walked directly in and ascended again to this room. I extinguished all the lamps. I sat here behind the lattice, sucking a plum in the darkness and listening to them argue down there in the enclosed garden. They told him in harsh whispers to leave her alone, to go back to his dirty tent in his accursed fields, and to let their sister follow her dreams to marry the king. They told him that he had ruined their chances, that he had dishonored them, that had insulted my crown and had brought them shame. He, the shepherd, said nothing to them, but only held her tightly with his herdsman's arm, his narrowed eyes ignoring or defying all they said. They went on in hushed, urgent tones, now pleading with him, now with her. I sat up here and watched them, the unmoved couple, dismissing silently their every reason and argument with the sheer force of their love for each other. The unassailable covenant they two had made together at a pool under wild apple trees in the hills months earlier. And when they, the brothers, knew that none of their appeals would succeed with him, the shepherd, the brothers now turned upon her, their sister, accusing her of having violated her covenant with her shepherd. It was the final arrow in their quiver, and they shot it at her. She has been with the king, one told her, or told the shepherd. She has been with the king, one of the brothers told the shepherd, in his private chambers up there, alone with his majesty, even earlier, in his tented pavilion. And he, the king, has found her to be above all women, he says, and has wooed her there. Another brother said, and she has been housed for days in his harem with his sultry concubines. And a third brother said, and now she has been in the palace, in the king's personal rooms, alone with him. She has feasted alone with the king behind his closed doors. And a fourth brother said to the shepherd, you silly country fool, what do you think went on in there? Do you imagine that she is still pure? How could you want her now? What will people say of you to have married a trollop defiled by a king in his wantonness? Do you want a king's whore for your wife? Think, man, think of your own repute. Solomon, says the Queen of Sheba, you listened to them say those things against her and against you, the king, in your own very garden, and you didn't respond? No, he says, I only listened and considered what I heard, that they might have been partly right about me, but they were altogether wrong about the girl. I could feel just then her gathering about me in the darkness. Yes, she came to me and spoke then. I had lost the girl, but she was with me. She? Who? The Lady Wisdom. Her hand touched me as I heard their complaints. Her hand? Wisdom's? Oh, King Solomon, you are too poetic, my friend. He smiles. Perhaps. She says, but what happened with the couple? How did they respond to her family's accusements? Well, the young shepherd spoke for the first time since he had called out the word beloved and her name from the street under my balcony. For all that time he had said nothing in the garden except with his defiant eyes. Now he spoke, not to them, not in any argument with those brothers. He spoke to her only. He turned to her and let his arm fall to his side. He took a step away from her and looked probing into her eyes. I leaned forward in the shadow of the awning to hear and see it. He asked her, when you were with the king, were you a door or were you a wall? That was it, his one question. He waited unmoving, looking at only her face in the moonlight. Her face, her eyes, fixed upon her brothers all the time they had berated her, fixed in sullen defiance at their pleadings and protests and insults. She looked at them, scanning their faces as they too waited for an answer to the shepherd's question, the question they thought they knew the answer to, but were certain she would not answer. She answered. She answered not them, but him only, the shepherd. I have been a wall, a firm wall. She turned fully to the shepherd. Never a door. And the Queen of Sheba says, and she had been a wall against you, Solomon, hadn't she? She had, always, a wall no man had broken down. And those brothers suddenly knew it too. She stood so beautifully there, saying it. I've never seen such beauty. Oh, they thought they could have proven it, could have brought her to Levites for a test of her virginity and all that. But of course they wouldn't, because they knew, as anyone would have known, hearing there the testament of her absolute and impenetrable monolithic virtue, they knew she had been a wall, even to them. They stood there in silence, those brothers, for a minute. There was nothing more they could say. That goat-herding and farming family who had so longed to become king's men, to rub up with royalty, and perhaps become city dwellers, now stricken dumb to realize that they must return, after all, to their inherited poor fields, consigned to them again now by this shepherd's resolute eyes and by her insistent declaration of faithfulness. Those brothers stood there in my rich garden, knowing they no longer had anything to bargain with and sensing the wearing off of their welcome. One of them, their father maybe, or their uncle, some older man among them, nodded to them all. They turned away to the gate that opened for them as though by its own accord. but really by the unseen hand of my listening and watching soldier. And they went out. The couple stood there in the garden watching them leave and watching the still opened gate that was to be now the archway of their marriage and future together. But they turned both briefly toward my latticed window, where only she might have guessed that I'd be sitting. He did not know I was there, did not need to know. He suspected it. And he said aloud, loud enough for this king to hear it, or if not the king, then only the stones of the king's palace. It would be enough, the resonance of his words intended to echo there the final cry of his victory, the victory of his love over the seductions of wealth and power. He said, King Solomon has vineyards in multitudes. He lets out his vineyards to keepers. Each one selling the fruit of it must bring him 1,000 pieces of silver. What? Said the Queen of Sheba. He said, what? Oh, the shepherd said it loudly. The whispered rumor, the price. It was known how each father had paid that much to the throne for me to wed his daughter and put her in my harem. The price her family had already paid. It was their disappointment, he meant. Not so much at being denied the marriage of their sister to the king, but at forfeiting the 1,000 silver shekels they had dedicated for me to marry her. That shepherd was calling them, not her, the true prostitutes, the veritable harlots who would have traded away her beauty and innocence with silver. Then that shepherd standing there in the garden raised his fist up toward me, toward the shadow where I sat unseen. How could he have known it? Right to me as though face to face with me. He raised his fist and said, my one vineyard, my own, is here with me. He reached out his other hand to her shoulder and pulled her close to him. She also looked up then. I looked from the darkness down at both with the same eyes now, the two pairs of the same narrowed eyes, united, burning against me, whom they could not see. And he said, but you, O Solomon, must have 1,000, and they who harvest your fruit earn but 200. These lines come right out of the Song of Solomon, by the way. We'll get to them later. The Queen of Sheba says, and you didn't respond? No. Why? How? It was true. I had taken many brides. He needed only the one. He knew even what I paid the harem keepers, 200. And he knew that his one bride had outweighed, priceless in value, not only to him, but to me as well, far more than all the many brides I had, and more than all the thousands that were paid for them to marry me. They were each worth only 1,000 pieces of silver, but her price was unnamed, unnameable, above rubies. So Solomon, they left. Oh yes, the couple, they left. The gate closed behind them, closed by the same unseen hand, the silent guard who had heard it all. My soldier who also knew the joke against me, who would doubtless tell it later at the barracks table to his rough companion soldiers, who would laugh quietly at the king who could buy anything, but who had been beaten by a common shepherd in love. They would laugh, and then they would fall silent, all of those soldiers, musing how they were in the employ of the same king, how they were paid to protect his bought brides and were part of the same cheapery. Did you, Solomon, never see her again? Did you not ever? The bracelets and earrings only. They were brought to me later with no message. I held the courier, an old shamefaced elder of the hill country. He was frightened at having been brought actually into my presence. I held him here for an hour, fed him well, and sent him away with a bag containing again the bracelets and earrings. and the 1,000 silver shekels, all bound and sealed with my signet and with a note for him, the shepherd, that it was only a gift, not a payment, for his wedding and for their children's inheritance. But that night, just after the couple left, I sat alone at this dark window, gathering wisdom about me, hearing her voice, Lady Wisdom's voice in his, indicting me in my folly. I saw it all, everything you too have said to me, my dear friend, Queen of Sheba. How I'd been driven since childhood to find her who could not be had, driven by my mother Bathsheba, obsessed with her own undeserved, self-imposed guilt, who had told me which women not to marry, but then told me to find the one impossibly pure woman, and in so doing had driven me to marry many in searching for her, even in neglect of my one true wife, Naamah. I saw the whole paradox and vanity of it as I sat there, the guilt and the driven hope for the vicarious redemption my mother had sought through her son, how she, my mother, sadly saw herself as Abishag, how she had feared that she was the very Abishag she had hoped to send away from me, but was thwarted from it by my anger and by my killing of Abishag's lover Adonijah. How Abishag herself was but the epitome of all of my father David's vain loves, including her, my mother Bathsheba, and his own also vain search for the perfect bride, the one woman he had killed a giant for, but was never allowed to marry. Merab, first daughter of Saul, the Merab of his dreams. How I too had married Abishag 1,000 times. Like father, I could not have her. How I had at last found my father's Merab in this shepherd's beloved, but couldn't purchase her. How nothing I had owned could ever be laid down as price enough to buy this young bride. And I saw then my father David and his Merab together at last in the couple going out of the gate. The fearless giant-slaying, lion and bear-killing shepherd poet and his beloved who could never be bought but only could be fought for and won. I was happy imagining this, fulfilled and finished. The long search was over. Oh, Solomon, you at last? Yes. I arose and came inside. I relit this room. I stirred the fire pit. I began burning, emptying my shelves of the hundreds of scrolls, the poems and songs I had written to be sung in vain ceremonial praise for each and every harem bride wedding. The room brightened like a revelation. I laughed watching all of those vain wedding songs burn. So this is what you told me earlier, Solomon, that you had burned some of your writings. Yes, my servants dared to look in at the door, this door here. They must have thought me mad, but it wasn't madness. It was the end, the burning away of all the madness. They summoned my counselor, Lord Zabud. I laughed when he came in and embraced him, my friend and confidant. I said, "It is finished, it is finished." He pushed me off and stared at me, and then at the bright dancing flames of the papers burning. "What's finished, my king?" And Zabud couldn't know, none of them have known, except for you now, my sweet Queen of Sheba. None of them have understood what burned away from me that night and why I laughed. I had married Abishag. Hundreds of times I had married Abishag in all that harem of bickering, grasping, stealthy brides. Vanity of vanities, I had sought Merab, but had found only Abishag everywhere, without love, and now it was over. I at last and at least had seen love. Lord Zabud thought I just needed some rest. I sent him instead to fetch me fresh paper, reeds, and ink. And that night and into the morning I sat alone at this very table, eating and drinking at the feast I had prepared for her, freed at last from my mother's conflicted demands, freed at last from the unfulfilled and frustrated longings bequeathed upon me by my poor unrequited father David. I wrote the song of all songs, the confession of my own weakness, dedicated to her who had freed me, also to her shepherd love, dedicated to her whom I will not name except to call her my Shulamith, the true match to my own name, my female counterpart, so dear to me, though far better than I, so near to me now, I never have to wed her, never have to see her or touch her, for she's mine in a far deeper way, in marrying the shepherd who was so much like my father. And you see it, don't you, my queen? You see that this was David and Merab at last together, that he at last, David, the light of Israel, had returned from his wars and troubles and sorrows in the person of this young shepherd to find his true desire. This was Israel, the shepherd and his bride. The frustrated Jacob at last alone with only his beloved Rachel. Abraham with Sarah only before Hagar, before Ishmael, before the conflict. And Sarah as though at last fruitful, and they too fulfilled in God's promise for them, and without the later troubles. And all our plagued history had come down to this, at last to this fulfillment, not found in the golden glories of a king, but in the simple marriage of the common shepherd who would not let his beloved be sold, his Adam's Eve, returned at last, unbesmirched and unduped by the whispering serpent. I had seen at last a vision of the true wisdom. And what was it, Solomon? What is this wisdom, love, your Shulamith? Was it love? Yes, love. That night, alone in this room, I fell in love with my one true wife, Naamah, all over again, though I knew she would never again, could never again return my love. Solomon and the Queen of Sheba sit together in silence. They nibble at bread dipped in oil. They watch the slow shadows slide across the room in the evening. They feel somewhere outside the window and very far away the great kingly sun roar and blaze as the little green earth turns from it into its own shadow and toward the star-flocked pastures of night. They chew and sip quietly in the unlamped twilit chamber. She sets her cup on the table and looks at him. Solomon, I see it. The shepherd and the king. I recall the story of your father David, how the prophet foretold his coming reign, a man after God's own heart, he said of him. Yes, Solomon says. And you said this was likely because Jehovah foresaw your father's undying love for his sons, even for the son Absalom, that this alone most resembled in David's heart the heart of your God. Yes, says Solomon. I find this one constancy above all else that I examine in my father. Everything else, every virtue was somehow negated in David, as in all men. Even in many of his psalms, we see his virtue negated by other virtues in other qualities in other songs. His high praises to God were thwarted by his base, miserable complaints. All else good in David stands opposed to something not good in him. Courage undone by later cowardice. Mercies canceled by vengefulness. Purity by, yes, Solomon, but there's something else I see in your father. Something later also undone, but as you've said, returned to at last. Solomon says, what is it that he... The Queen of Sheba says, it's that your father was a shepherd. Only a shepherd, nothing more. when God spoke this thing to him about King Saul, or spoke this thing of him to King Saul. Haven't you seen it? Your father had not yet done any of these other things, good or bad. He had done only one thing at the time the prophet anointed him and said his heart was akin to God's heart. He had only shepherded. So, Solomon says, she continues, and it was King Saul to whom God had said this first, as though meaning, I have chosen a shepherd instead of you, Saul, for a shepherd's heart is akin to my own. Solomon says nothing. Solomon, what was King Saul's profession in the years before he became king? Well, yes, he was also an animal herder, but he was a herder of donkeys, as was his father Kish. An unsuccessful herder of donkeys at that. Several she-donkeys had broken away and had run off. Young Saul was sent to scour the whole region of Ephraim and Bethlehem and Benjamin for them. It was during his search for the rebellious she-donkeys that he met Samuel, who then anointed him to be the first king of Israel. The queen of Sheba clucks at this. A herder of asses. Ha! The first king was only a futile herder of recalcitrant she-donkeys. The second king, replacing him as a man after God's own heart, was an effective herder of sheep. You see this, don't you, Solomon? He warms to the analogy. Yes, why did God choose first a man who had done nothing more than herd donkeys, and later a man who had done nothing more than herd sheep? The shepherd of the Song of Solomon gets the girl. The king does not. There's a poetic in here that Solomon wanted to get on paper when he wrote this mystic and beautiful poetry. He wants to point out that the true ideal is going to be found in Israel's memory of being originally a shepherding people. From Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's sons. The ideal of the shepherd, when God looks at Esau the hunter and looks at Jacob the shepherd, he says later, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. He certainly wasn't speaking about them personally, but about their vocations. Abel was a shepherd. Cain was a hard-working farmer. Both of them came to offer their gifts to God. God had respect unto the shepherd's offering, but unto the farmer's offering he had no respect. What is it about shepherding that matters? Well, I've written a bunch of other stuff about it I won't go into tonight, but it seems to be a mysterious precept in the Bible. In the Gospel of John, there are no parables. Wait a minute. People say that. They forget one right in the exact center of the Gospel of John. Then Jesus stands and tells the Good Shepherd parable. And after he tells it, John says, now this one parable he spake, and his disciples understood it not. That's the heart, the centerpiece of the Gospel of John. Christ being the shepherd. Something metaphorical and prophetic in the Song of Solomon, where the shepherd gets the bride and the king cannot have her. What I was just describing, the one woman that David really loved. David would have about 20 wives, counting 10 of them concubines. David didn't seem to love any of his wives. How do I know this? Because they were all still alive when David was an old man on his deathbed. He said, I can't get any heat in my body. They covered him with blankets. He said, you idiots, that's not the kind of heat I'm talking about. I want a nice-looking young woman to get my blood racing again, get my heart pumping. And they actually held a beauty contest all over Israel to find the most beautiful girl they could find, Abishag, and brought her. David was too old and sick to perform, shall we say, matrimonially with her. but she comforted David by lying next to him. Now, if he had loved any of his other wives, why is he still as an old man looking for another? Bathsheba was still alive, we will learn. Others of his wives, Haggith, Abigail, Maacah, these other women David had been married to, Ahinoam, they were still alive. Why doesn't he call one of them in? Well, they'd gotten fat by then. Yeah, a nice fat one would do real good to warm the bed up for him. Well, you know, it just doesn't make sense. Only one answer to it, that David still felt unrequited in love, and before dying he wanted to find true love at least once in his life. He had marriages, but not true love. He had missed the woman he really wanted to marry way back when he was a shepherd's boy. Merab, the eldest daughter of King Saul, the only woman he ever fought a giant to win, because Saul had promised, the man who kills that giant will marry my oldest daughter, Merab. And Saul reneged on his promise. There's the statement, a promise broken is a debt unpaid, and it breaks the heart. I forget how it says it in the King James. You remember, Brother James? Well, you're King James. I mean, I'm giving the St. Patrick version. You have to give the King James version. It'll come to me later, but David's heart was broken, and he never found love like that again. I think the one woman he ever truly loved and could not have, and now this is echoed in his son Solomon, married hundreds of times, but never could marry the one woman he felt he could have truly loved. Now, next Wednesday night we're going to open the Bible, not my writings, and we're going to look actually verse by verse through the Song of Solomon and try to decide who's speaking this part. Is this the harem brides talking here? Or what about this part? Is that Solomon talking? Or is that the shepherd talking? Or is that the girl talking? We'll be looking through it and trying to decide how to put it up there. I have all of my translation of it on a text, and I'll need to email it to you, Sister Barbara, if you're going to be doing the screen, so we can get my own writings up there on the screen and this one and going through it. But in writing the Song of Solomon, David is not only equating with his father David, the one woman I should have married, I couldn't have her. I could have everything else but her. Well, go back to Bathsheba's prophecy. You know, in Proverbs 31, it says, these are the words of King Lemuel, even the prophecy that his mother taught him. And down in there, she asked the question, oh, my son Lemuel. Bathsheba called Solomon Lemuel. It means given to God. I gave you to God. She gets down there and says, my son Solomon, who can find the one virtuous woman? That's interesting. She doesn't say, Solomon, go out and find the one virtuous woman. No, she puts it as a question. Who can find her? And the answer to that question is David couldn't find her. Solomon couldn't find her. Saul of Tarsus couldn't find her. There's evidence that as Saul of Tarsus, he had once been married, and she left him when he became a holy roller preacher, and she never came back to him, and he never married again as St. Paul. There is evidence that Abraham was unrequited in love. Jacob, one woman the only woman he wanted to marry, he was forced to marry 3 others, and they're the only ones that gave him children for a long, long time. And then finally she gave him 2 children and died in childbirth. He never got to share fatherhood and motherhood for the children they had between them. Never happened. What we have is this failure all the way through the Bible to form the perfect marriages. Not that there aren't some perfect marriages, but in the Bible story, the question hangs, who can find that one perfect bride? And there's only one true answer, and that's the perfect bridegroom. Jesus Christ finds his bride. Who is this perfect bride? She's not only a metaphor for the church. Maybe in the Song of Solomon, the girl is a true person living in Israel somewhere. But she's also a metaphor for Lady Wisdom herself. Solomon's mother said, "This one woman you should marry, who can find her? Her price is above rubies." In Solomon's later poetry, he would ask 3 times, "Can you lay hold of Lady Wisdom? For her price is beyond that of rubies." Thank you very much for your attention tonight and for bearing with my poor presentation of it, Brother James.